beyond the farther descending slope. Piercing blue eyes. Presumably the notes which we hear at such moments tend to spread out before our eyes, over surfaces greater or smaller, according to their pitch and volume. Set in it the gem of a glance from her own eyes. She allowed her eyes to wander over the space that lay between us, in my direction, without any particular expression, without appearing to have seen me, but with an intensity, a half-hidden smile which I was unable to interpret, according to the instruction I had received in the ways of good breeding, save as a mark of infinite disgust. She closed her eyes and began to yawn, so as to indicate that it was a desire to sleep, and that alone which had made her lie down there. She coquettishly enhanced the charm of the smile which the idea had brought to her lips, by giving to her blue eyes, which were fixed on the general, a gentle, dreamy expression. She had the street beneath her eyes. She was gazing, with bended head, out of those great eyes. Shuddering with emotion, I could not take my agonized eyes away from my mother's face, which was not to appear that evening in the bedroom where I could see myself already lying in imagination, and wished only that I were lying dead. Since she could not bring into play the deliberate glances charged with a definite meaning which one directs in a crowd towards people whom one knows, but must allow her vague thoughts to escape continually from her eyes in a flood of blue light which she was powerless to control, she was anxious not to distress in any way, not to seem to be despising those humbler mortals over whom the current flowed, by whom it was everywhere arrested. So effective was this that the whole room had the appearance of one of those model bedrooms which you see nowadays in housing exhibitions, decorated with works of art which are calculated by their designer to refresh the eyes of whoever may ultimately have to sleep in the rooms. So great and glorious a figure was the President of the French Republic in the eyes of Dr. Cottard that neither the modesty of Swann nor the spite of Madame Verdurin could ever wholly efface that first impression. So he and Madame Verdurin, who, at the other side of the room where the painter was, telling her a story, was shutting her eyes preparatory to flinging her face into her hands, resembled two masks in a theater, each representing comedy, but in a different way. So much so that it made their value be confessed, their divine sweetness be tasted by all those same onlookers, provided only that they were in any sense musical, who, the next moment, would ignore, would disown them in real life, in every individual love that came into being beneath their eyes. Sometimes, when I had put out my candle, my eyes would close so quickly that I had not even time to say, "I'm going to sleep." Still, I pointed out one that had the same color as her eyes. Suddenly, I stood still, unable to move, as happens when something appears that requires not only our eyes to take it in, but involves a deeper kind of perception and takes possession of the whole of our being. Swann could read in her eyes that terror lest he should ask her not to go. Swann endeavored to console him. "After all, she is quite right," he said to the young man, drawing his eyes for him and taking off the fez to make him feel more at ease. "Take care, Master Biche," she reminded the painter, whom it was a time-honored pleasantry to address as master, to catch that nice look in his eyes, that witty little twinkle. That perfidious woman, her eyes tinseled with a smile of complicity for Forcheville, which was what Odette had become for Swann in the last 48 hours. The absence of Mademoiselle Swann, which, since it preserved me from the terrible risk of seeing her appear on one of the paths, and of being identified and scorned by this so privileged little girl, who had Bergot for a friend and used to go with him to visit cathedrals, made the exploration of Pensionville, now for the first time permitted me, a matter of indifference to myself, seemed, however, to invest the property in my grandfather's and father's eyes with a fresh and transient charm. The courage of one's opinions is always a form of calculating cowardice in the eyes of the other side. The creature who might have been led astray was a woman with frank eyes. The different changes and chances that bring us into the company of certain other people in this life do not coincide with the periods in which we are in love with those people, but overlapping them may occur before love has begun and may be repeated after love is ended. The earliest appearances in our life of a creature who is destined to afford us pleasure later on assume retrospectively in our eyes a certain value as an indication, a warning, a presage. The material presence of a living actress before our eyes. The pleasure which the music gave him, which was shortly to create in him a real longing, was in fact closely akin, at such moments, to the pleasure which we would have derived from experimenting with perfumes, from entering into contact with a world for which we men were not created, which appears to lack form because our eyes cannot perceive it, to lack significance because it escapes our intelligence, to which we may attain by way of one sense only. The princess, breaking into a laugh which was one of her characteristics, and was intended at once to show the rest of an assembly that she was making fun of someone, and also to enhance her own beauty by concentrating her features around her animated lips and sparkling eyes, answered, "Why, he's never been better in his life." The time had long passed when, on our first coming to spend our holidays at Cambrai, we had been of equal importance in Franchise's eyes with my aunt. The torment which had forced him to leave his own house had lost its sharpness when it lost its uncertainty, now that Odette's other life, of which he had at that first moment a sudden, helpless suspicion, was definitely there, almost within his grasp, before his eyes. They passed in a scattered sequence before me, at random, without reality, containing in themselves no beauty that my eyes might have endeavored, as in the old days, to extract from them and to compose in a picture. They took shape and grew solid before his eyes. This contrivance would make me ridiculous in Swan's eyes. This smile rested upon myself, who had never ceased to follow her with my eyes. This young gentleman has her beautiful eyes. Those great, sad eyes, those were youthful acquaintances on whom the old friends of the family, like my relatives, shut their eyes all the more good-naturedly. Though he did not die until many years later, not one of us ever set eyes on him again. Thus, his jealousy did even more than the happy, passionate desire which he had originally felt for Odette had done to alter Swan's character, completely changing, in the eyes of the world, even the outward signs by which that character had been intelligible. To dream together, to gaze in each other's eyes. To have left even the tiniest morsel in the dish would have shown as much discourtesy as to rise and leave a concert hall while the piece was still being played, and under the composer's very eyes. To plant in the depths of its unvalued eyes a lingering sense, uncertain but not unpleasing, half memory and half oblivion. To the one who was in search of a friend, he said, with a smile, "But how nice of you! You've put on blue eyes to go with your sash." With eyes starting from his head. Without daring to lift his eyes to the newspaper, he opened it, turned the page so as not to see again the words "Fille de Marbre," and began to read mechanically the news from the provinces. You must tell me all about him. He went on, fastening a pair of goggle eyes on the celebrity. Face. A few months later, if my grandfather asked Swan's new friend, "What about Swan? Do you still see as much of him as ever?" the other's face would lengthen. Never mention his name to me again. A fine, thoughtful face. A smile of joy, a pious act of thanksgiving to God, who is pleased to grant that life shall be less cruel than our dreams, feebly illuminated her face. Although I could not see her face clearly enough, I am sure that the expression must have appeared on it which my grandmother had once found so delightful. And just as, before kissing Odette for the first time, he had sought to imprint upon his memory the face that for so long had been familiar, before it was altered by the additional memory of their kiss, so he could have wished, in thought at least, to have been in a position to bid farewell, where she still existed, to that Odette who had inspired love in him and jealousy, to that Odette who had caused him to suffer, and whom now he would never see again. And Swan it was who, before she allowed her face, as though despite her efforts, to fall upon his lips, held it back for a moment longer, at a little distance between his hands. And the care which I took to focus all my attention upon her face succeeded in isolating it so completely that today, when I call that marriage ceremony to mind, I find it impossible to visualize any single person who was present except her. Besides, what good has it ever done when I have set my face against them? Brichot appealed to Madame Verdurin, who, swooning with merriment, her eyes tightly closed, had buried her face in her two hands, from between which, now and then, escaped a muffled scream. But now I found myself slightly shocked by this attitude which Swan invariably adopted when face to face with generalities. But while each of these attachments, each of these flirtations had been the realization, more or less complete, of a dream born of the sight of a face or a form which Swan had spontaneously and without effort on his part found charming, it was quite another matter when, one day at the theatre, he was introduced to Odette de Crécy by an old friend of his own, who had spoken of her to him as a ravishing creature with whom he might very possibly come to an understanding, but had made her out to be harder of conquest than she actually was, so as to appear to be conferring a special favor by the introduction. Did you notice the face he pulled when he saw that she wasn't here? Each time we see the face or hear the voice, it is our own ideas of him which we recognize and to which we listen. Each visit revived the sense of disappointment which he felt at the sight of a face whose details he had somewhat forgotten in the interval. Françoise was amused by the look of consternation on my aunt's face. He implored her in vain, with that look of despair on her face, which even his coachman had noticed, to come home with him, and then turned away, solitary, crushed. He saw her face change its shape. He wielded the supreme power with all the arrogance of a man who has not been subjected to a discipline in his youth, so much so that, whenever he saw a man in a town whose face he did not remember, he would massacre the whole place to the last inhabitant. He wished her to come to him, and before she came, he wished to have already procured for her some pleasure, so as to watch her gratitude taking shape in her face and molding her smile. Her face lighted up, and she jumped for joy. Her face was exceedingly red, as it always was for some time after a meal. Her whole face would seem to grow larger. His pale face, never losing its nobility or its melancholy, never showing any sign of trouble at such a transubstantiation, his personality was now so divided that the strain of waiting for the imminent moment when he would find himself face to face once more with the phrase, convulsed him in one of those sobs which a fine line of poetry or a piece of alarming news will wring from us. I brought my mind to bear upon that face. In my cowardice, I became at once a man, and did what all we grown men do when face to face with suffering and injustice. I preferred not to see them. Indeed, one could tell him only by his voice, for it was difficult to make out his face with its arched nose and green eyes. It flitted across the face of his mistress. It seems impossible that any thought of charity can ever have found expression in her vulgar and energetic face. It sometimes happened, again, that when, after meeting Swann, she saw some man approaching whom he did not know, he could distinguish upon Odette's face that look of sorrow which she had worn on the day when he had come to her while Forcheville was there. I have nothing to set my face against. Later on, when, in the course of my life, I have had occasion to meet with, in convents for instance, literally saintly examples of practical charity, they have generally had the brisk, decided, undisturbed, and slightly brutal air of a busy surgeon, the face in which one can discern no commiseration, no tenderness at the sight of suffering humanity, and no fear of hurting it, the face devoid of gentleness or sympathy, the sublime face of true goodness. Legrandin's face showed an extraordinary zeal and animation. Monsieur Vinteuil, turning out of another street, found himself so suddenly face to face with us all that he had not time to escape. Madame Verdurin, so that her silence should have the appearance not of consent but of the unconscious silence which inanimate objects preserve, had suddenly emptied her face of all life, of all mobility. My dears, laugh at me if you like. It is not conventionally beautiful, but there is something in its quaint old face which pleases me. Neuralgia all down my face, like last time. Odette had looked on, impassive, at this scene, but when the door had closed behind Sagnette, she had forced the normal expression of her face down, as the saying is, by several pegs. Odette's face appeared thinner and more prominent than it actually was, because her forehead and the upper part of her cheeks, a single and almost plain surface, were covered by the masses of hair which women wore at that period, drawn forward in a fringe, raised in crimped waves and falling in stray locks over her ears. On hearing these words, Cottard exhibited an intense astonishment blended with entire submission, as though in the face of a scientific truth which contradicted everything that he had previously believed, but was supported by an irresistible weight of evidence. Other people, when they met him, saw all the graces enthroned in his face. She awoke and half turned her face, which I could see for the first time. She could see the tortured expression which was never absent from the old man's face in those terrible last years. She turned away with an indifferent and contemptuous air, withdrew herself so as to spare her face the indignity of remaining within her field of vision. The air of jubilation with which she felt bound to illuminate her face whenever she had to announce his arrival did not altogether correspond to what was felt by her invalid. The doctor, who had come into the box with a smile which waited before settling upon or vanishing from his face until someone in authority should enlighten him as to the merits of the spectacle. The face he pulled, the face of a woman who, I would think, was perhaps an actress. The general greeted Swann, and noticing the look of strain on his face and concluding that it was perhaps a serious illness that had kept him away, went on, "You're looking well, old man." The general's monocle stuck like a shell splinter in his common, scarred, victorious, overbearing face. The Invidia gang should have had some look on her face of envy. The next day he had seen her face to face with Madame Verdurin. The rest of her face, the surface of her face, which was red, as though she had been very warm. Then gradually reappeared and rose before him, softly radiant, the face of the other Odette. Then her face assumed an expression of anger. There she was, awfully tired, her face left blank. They contrived also to put into a face from which its distinction had been evicted, a face vacant and roomy as an untenanted house. To see her look displeased destroyed all the sense of tranquility she had brought me a moment before, when she bent her loving face down over my bed and held it out to me like a host, for an act of communion in which my lips might drink deeply the sense of her real presence, and with it the power to sleep. Watching Swann's face while he listened to the phrase, one would have said that he was inhaling an anesthetic which allowed him to breathe more deeply. We are reduced to the evidence of our own senses, and we ask ourselves, in the face of this detached and incoherent fragment of recollection, whether indeed our senses have not been the victims of a hallucination. What she really just desecrated, what she corrupted into ministering to her pleasures, but what remained between them and her and prevented her from any direct enjoyment of them, was the likeness between her face and his. When she had uttered her request, she would watch my aunt covertly, trying to guess from the expression on her face what she thought of it and how she would reply. Faces. He had watched the passage of the same expressions of pity for a sufferer, resentment of an act of injustice, gratitude for an act of kindness, which he had seen in earlier days on his own mother's face and on the faces of friends. She reminded him even more than was usual of the faces of some of the women created by the painter of the Primavera. She would go out again sad and discouraged, but still smiling, for she was so humble and so sweet that her gentleness towards others and her continual subordination of herself and of her own troubles appeared on her face blended in a smile which, unlike those seen on the majority of human faces, had no trace in it of irony. The faces of the passers-by were strange. When it was the little phrase that spoke to him of the vanity of his sufferings, Swann found a sweetness in that very wisdom which, but a little while back, had seemed to him intolerable when he thought that he could read it on the faces of indifferent strangers, who would regard his love as a digression that was without importance. Failing light and saturated atmosphere. Here and there, in the distance, in a landscape which, what with the failing light and saturated atmosphere, resembled a seascape rather, a few solitary houses clinging to the lower slopes of the hill, whose heights were buried in a cloudy darkness, shone out like little boats which had folded their sails and would ride at anchor all night upon the sea. Fair hair. The beadle, by moving to one side, enabled me to see, sitting in a chapel, a lady with fair hair. Fair, reddish hair. A little girl with fair, reddish hair, who appeared to be returning from a walk, and held a trowel in her hand, was looking at us, raising towards us a face powdered with pinkish freckles. Fallen leaves. A roof, the sound of a bell, the smell of fallen leaves, a confused mass of different images. Feather. Against the opening horizon, I had just seen, like a miraculous sign, Mademoiselle's blue feather. I remarked for the first time how common her speech was, and that she had, alas, no blue feather in her hat. I tried to persuade my mother to get for Francoise a waterproof coat and a hat with a blue feather. Features. A justice whose grayish and meanly regular features were the very same as those which adorned the faces of certain good and pious and slightly withered ladies. A shade of good humor or of arrogance on her features would provide Françoise with matter for a mental commentary. And my gaze resting upon her fair hair, her blue eyes, the lines of her neck, and overlooking the features which might have reminded me of the faces of other women, I cried out within myself. And then, as soon as he had left the house, not without returning to kiss her once again, because he had forgotten to take away with him, in memory, some detail of her fragrance or of her features, while he drove home in his Victoria, blessing the name of Odette, who allowed him to pay her these daily visits. But as he must also be prepared to face the alternative, he never dared to allow this smile a definite expression on his features, and you would see there a perpetually flickering uncertainty in which you might decipher the question that he never dared to ask. Do you really mean that? But even this ugliness of faces, which of course were mostly familiar to him, seemed something new and uncanny, now that their features, instead of being to him symbols of practical utility in the identification of this or that man, who until then had represented merely so many pleasures to be sought after, boredoms to be avoided, or courtesies to be acknowledged, were at rest, measurable by aesthetic coordinates alone, in the autonomy of their curves and angles. But were he to learn more of them, he feared lest her past, now colorless, fluid and supportable, might assume a tangible and obscene form with individual and diabolical features. Finally, the phrase withdrew and vanished, pointing, directing, diligent among the wandering currents of its fragrance, leaving upon Swann's features a reflection of its smile. He had always found a peculiar fascination in tracing in the paintings of the old masters not merely the general characteristics of the people whom he encountered in his daily life, but rather what seems least susceptible of generalization, the individual features of men and women whom he knew. Her cheekbones too prominent, her features too tightly drawn. I felt that, to her, we must be an object of scorn, which distressed me particularly on account of the daughter, such a pretty little girl, as I had heard, and one of whom I used often to dream, always imagining her with the same features and appearance, which I bestowed upon her quite arbitrarily, but with a charming effect. Perhaps, moreover, Swann himself was fixing upon these features of an Odette not yet possessed, not even kissed by him, on whom he was looking now for the last time, that comprehensive gaze with which, on the day of his departure, a traveler strives to bear away with him in memory the view of a country to which he may never return. Perhaps, on the other hand, he had retained enough of the artistic temperament to be able to find a genuine satisfaction in watching these individual features take on a more general significance when he saw them uprooted and disembodied in the abstract idea of similarity between a historic portrait and a modern original, whom it was not intended to represent. She would detect the most furtive movement of Françoise's features, showing upon his features a foretaste of happiness and peace. The particular features which I remarked in this lady, if I attempted to catalogue them, formulated themselves in precisely the same terms. This woman, the play of whose features were intonations of whose voice, like so many others I already knew, made me regard her, in spite of myself, as a young lady of good family, her who was no longer of a family at all. Tradition would have it that the weaver had given to Ahasuerus features of one of the kings of France, and to Esther those of a lady of Guermantes, whose lover he had been. Feet. A strange and pitiless mirror of square feet, which stood across one corner of the room, cleared for itself a site I had not looked to find tenanted in the quiet surroundings of my normal field of vision. By a fine stroke of the painter's invention, she is tumbling all the treasures of the earth at her feet, but exactly as if she were treading grapes in a wine press to extract their juice, or, still more, as if she had climbed on a heap of sacks to raise herself higher. Do you hither guide the feet of this timid Israelite? Doubtless it makes in us an imperceptible progress, and the truths which have changed for us, its meaning and its aspect, which have opened new paths before our feet, we had for long been preparing for their discovery, but that preparation was unconscious. I tried to convince myself that they were of no importance, really, since I should have forgotten them next morning, and to fix my mind on thoughts of the future which would carry me, as on a bridge, across the terrifying abyss that yawned at my feet. It was all he could do to keep on his feet. Like fresh rungs of the ladder on which I might set my feet, which were going to allow me to advance a step further and finally to attain the happiness which I had not yet encountered. Mademoiselle Vantoy shuddered and rose to her feet. Swann passed by an office in which the lackeys, seated like notaries before their massive registers, rose solemnly to their feet and inscribed his name. The pianist rose to his feet. Fern. A fern which I had never found among the woods. Field. She was in fact summoning me to cross the snowy lawn to her camp, to take the field, which the sun, by casting over it a rosy gleam, the metallic luster of old and worn brocades, had turned into a field of the cloth of gold. Fields. It would be overflowing with the offerings of the milkman, the fruiterer, the greengrocer, come sometimes from distant villages to dedicate here the first fruits of their fields. My eyes followed up the slope, which, outside the hedge, rose steeply to the fields. Figure. Acknowledging with a rapid glance the courtesy of the gentlemen in carriages, who, recognizing her figure at a distance, were raising their hats to her and saying to one another that there was never anyone so well turned out as she. As we drew near the house, we would make out a figure standing upon the doorstep, and Mamma would say to me, "Good heavens! There is Françoise looking out for us. Your aunt must be anxious. That means we are late." But forced for so many years now, by a sort of grafting process, to share the life of feminine humanity, they called to my mind the figure of the dryad, the fair worldling, swiftly walking, brightly colored, whom they sheltered with their branches as she passed beneath them, and obliged to acknowledge, as they themselves acknowledged, the power of the season. I now no longer had the impression of being confronted by a particular passage in one of Bergot's works, which traced a purely bidimensional figure in outline upon the surface of my mind, but rather of the ideal passage of Bergot, common to every one of his books, and to which all the earlier similar passages, now becoming merged in it, had added a kind of density and volume, by which my own understanding seemed to be enlarged. She would look at him sulkily, and he would see once again a face worthy to figure in Botticelli's Life of Moses, tall, with a good figure. Fine days. I saw it attain to that fixed, unalterable gold of fine days. Fine weather. This more than ever from the day on which fine weather definitely set in. Wearing those badges of rank, she would, in fine weather, go on foot from one house to another in the same neighborhood. Finer air, the walls of which, washed with rippling, contain, like the polished sides of a basin in which the water glows with a blue lurking fire, a finer air, pure, azure-tinted saline. Finger. As for Swan, in my attempt to resemble him, I spent the whole time, when I was at table, in drawing my finger along my nose and in rubbing my eyes. A quivering of her tiny finger. He would pass a finger over his tired eyelids in the same way as he might have wiped his eyeglass, and would cease altogether to think. I felt that I had, with an impious and secret finger, traced a first wrinkle upon her soul, and made the first white hair show upon her head. It was always to the steeple that one must return. Always it was the steeple which dominated everything else, summoning up the houses with an unexpected pinnacle, raised before me like the finger of God, whose body might have been concealed below, among the crowd of human bodies without fear of my confounding it, for that reason, with them. Swan had begun, out of politeness, to finger the bronzes, and did not like to stop. Then, on reaching Odette's gate, he had begged to be allowed to come in too, and she had replied with a finger pointed at Swan, "Ah, that depends on this gentleman." Finger and thumb. He took a firm hold of the card, which was sliding to and fro, the envelope being too large for it, and then, by moving it with his finger and thumb, brought one line after another beneath the part of the envelope where the paper was not doubled, through which alone it was possible to read. Fingers. A docile body which he had pressed tightly in his arms and explored with his fingers. A profound sagacity in refusing to know them, or even to dirty the tips of his fingers with them. But her method, an echo of her charming touch, came to life now and then in the fingers of her pupils. It was true that Odette played vilely, but often the fairest impression that remains in our minds of a favorite air is one which has arisen out of a jumble of wrong notes struck by unskillful fingers upon a tuneless piano. Just as if the gentle grazing touch of the clocks of peasant women going into the church and of their fingers dipping into the water had, managed by age-long repetition to acquire a destructive force. My fingers parted and I let fall the coin, which found a receptacle in a confused but outstretched hand. She returned from some walk along the road where she had known that he would not appear, drawing from her submissive fingers long gloves of a precious, useless chime. So that for some time there was no change from the procedure which he had followed on that first evening, when he had started by touching her throat with his fingers. Fire. A moment earlier, the sound of the doorbell, swelling in the depths of his abyss of sleep into the clangor of an alarm, had engendered the episode of the fire. A young footman, his body slightly bent forward, rearing about his crimson gorget and even more crimson face, from which seemed to burst forth torrents of fire, timidity, and zeal. Coming at a moment when she felt well and was not in a perspiration, the news that the house was being destroyed by a fire, in which all the rest of us had already perished, a fire which, in a little while, would not leave one stone standing upon another, but from which she herself would still have plenty of time to escape without undue haste, provided that she rose at once from her bed. I am just going to see that my fire hasn't gone out. It was they that started the fire. Now, alas, it still happened at times that she wrote to him from a restaurant or hotel, on paper, which bore a printed address, but printed in letters of fire that seared his heart. We're not in any hurry. You're dashing around as if the house was on fire. Firewood. He had quite forgotten and would have continued to discuss his supply of firewood so as to hide from his servant the emotion that he had felt and to give himself time to break away from the thraldom of his anxieties and abandon himself to pleasure. The coachman returned, but, As he drew up opposite him, Swan asked not, "Did you find the lady?" but, "Remind me tomorrow to order in some more firewood." Firmament. Human as it was from this point of view, it belonged nonetheless to an order of supernatural creatures whom we have never seen, but whom, in spite of that, we recognize and acclaim with rapture when some explorer of the unseen contrives to coach one forth to bring it down from that divine world to which he has access to shine for a brief moment in the firmament of ours. Fish. And so I concerned myself no longer with the mystery that lay hidden in a form or a perfume, quite at ease in my mind, since I was taking it home with me, protected by its visible and tangible covering, beneath which I should find it still alive, like the fish which, on days which I had been allowed to go out fishing, I used to carry back in my basket, buried in a couch of grass which kept them cool and fresh. I decided that I would come there again with a line and catch fish. I would always be just on the point of asking his name when someone would make a sign to me to be quiet, or I would frighten the fish. It was not actually my duty to warn Mademoiselle Swan that the fish was biting. Fish or fowl, not like the other fellow, who's never definitely fish or fowl. Fishing. In her mind's eye, she could see his sister, Madame de Cambremer, alighting from her carriage at the door of our hotel, just as we were on the point of going out fishing, and obliging us to remain indoors all afternoon to entertain her. Flame. As soon as she found herself face to face with the man to whom she was obliged to lie, she became uneasy. All her ideas melted like wax before a flame. But their faces, a collective and formless mass, escaped the grasp of his imagination, and so failed to feed the flame of his jealousy. I would sleep wrapped up, as it were, in a great cloak of snug and savory air, shot with the glow of the logs which would break out again in flame. There was in his soul that want of adaptability which can be seen in the bodies of certain people who, when the moment comes to avoid a collision, to snatch their clothes out of reach of a flame, or to perform any other such necessary movement, take their time, as the saying is, begin by remaining for a moment in their original position, as though seeking to find in it a starting point, a source of strength and motion. Fleas. To be eaten by fleas and all sorts of creatures. Flesh. Apart from and above that common run of humanity with which the sight, pure and simple, of her in the flesh had made me for a moment confound her, I grew indignant. Depth of character or a melancholy expression on a woman's face would freeze his senses, which would, however, immediately melt at the sight of healthy, abundant, rosy human flesh. "He takes most after his father," muttered my uncle, who was no more anxious to effect an introduction by proxy in repeating Mamma's name aloud than to bring the two together in the flesh. The sereneness, the depression of the preceding years had been followed by a sort of spiritual superabundance, without his knowing to what he owed this unlooked-for enrichment of his life, any more than a person in delicate health, who from a certain moment grows stronger, puts on flesh, and seems for a time to be on the road to complete recovery. There is no flesh in the world as soft. When his eyes fell upon the photograph of Odette on his table, or when she came to see him, he had difficulty in identifying her face, either in the flesh or on the pasteboard, with the painful and continuous anxiety which dwelt in his mind. Whereas the mere sight of her in the flesh, by perpetually reviving his misgivings as to the quality of her face, her figure, the whole of her beauty, used to cool the ardor of his love, those misgivings were swept away, and that love confirmed now that he could re-erect his estimate of her on the sure foundations of his aesthetic principles. flesh and blood. The vague feeling of sympathy which attracts a spectator to a work of art, now that he knew the type, in warm flesh and blood. Flies. The fly's music is bound to the season by a closer, a more vital tie. Born of sunny days, and not to be reborn, but with them. Flints. Its great wall was thrust upwards from a basement of unfaced ashlar, jagged with flints. Flood. But since Swan had become so melancholy, and was always in that trembling condition which precedes a flood of tears, he had the same need to speak about his grief that a murderer has to tell someone about his crime. Flow. The vivant began to flow again more swiftly. Flower. He always has a flower in his buttonhole. He held it pressed to his lips during the drive home, and when, in due course, the flower withered, locked it away, like something very precious, in a secret drawer of his desk. He would select a flower for his buttonhole. Higher up on the altar, a flower had opened here and there with a careless grace, holding so unconcernedly, like a final, almost vaporous bedisme, its bunch of stamens, slender as gossamer, which clouded the flower itself in a white mist, that in following these with my eyes, in trying to imitate somewhere inside myself the action of their blossoming, I imagined it as a swift and thoughtless movement of the head with an enticing glance from her contracted pupils by a young girl in white, careless and alive. Its only companions a clump of daffodils, come out before their time, a few primroses, the first in flower, while here and there burned the blue flame of a violet, its stem bent beneath the weight of the drop of perfume stored in its tiny home. She murmured, "How charming it is," with a stress on the opening consonants of the adjective, a token of her refinement, by which she felt her lips so romantically compressed, like the petals of a beautiful budding flower, that she instinctively brought her eyes into harmony, illuminating them for a moment with a vague and sentimental gaze. She passed him, light, soothing, as softly murmured as the perfume of a flower. Flowering grasses. From the first moment, my mind was drugged by the unfamiliar scent of flowering grasses. Flowers, as it might have seemed to the first man when he enjoyed it amid the flowers of the earthly paradise, a pleasure which had never before existed, which he was striving now to create. Between the flowers and the blackened stones towards which they leaned, if my eyes could discern no interval, my mind preserved the impression of an abyss. But, don't you see, I really had to fasten the flowers. Flowers of spring. Like the nosegay which a traveler sends us from some land to which we shall never go again, come and let me breathe from the far country of your adolescence the scent of the flowers of spring, among which I also used to wander many years ago. Fly, the rumble and buzz in the silence of its village street of the fly on the wheel of the coach. Flying foam, swathed for 6 months in the year in a shroud of fog and flying foam from the waves. Foam. As dawn spread westward over the raging sea, from whose driven foam I would seek shelter in that church in the Persian manner. Foliage. It has taken solid form in dense masses of foliage over which the rain may pour in torrents without weakening the resistance offered by the real and lasting happiness. Foot. As soon as I was in the presence of that Gilbert swan, on the sight of whom I had counted to revive the images that my tired memory had lost and could not find again, of that Gilbert swan with whom I had been playing the day before, and whom I had just been prompted to greet, and then to recognize by a blind instinct like that which, when we are walking, sets one foot before the other, without giving us time to think that we are doing. Then at once it became as though she and the little girl who had inspired my dreams had been two different people. Forces of nature. Françoise, a colonel with all the forces of nature for her subalterns, as in the fairy tales where giants hire themselves out as scullions, would be stirring the coals, putting the potatoes to steam, and, at the right moment, finishing over the fire those culinary masterpieces. Forehead. And then, his anguish becoming too keen, he passed his hand over his forehead, let the monocle drop from his eye, and wiped its glass. Her rounded forehead was nothing now, but an exquisite study in high relief. Forest. I passed through forest groves in which the morning light, breaking them into new sections, lopped and trimmed the trees, united different trunks in marriage, made nosegays of their branches. Sometimes she would be absent for several days on end, when the veterans took her to see the tombs at Dreux or to Compiègne, on the painter's advice, to watch the sun setting through the forest. Forget-me-nots. It would console me for the blackness and bareness of the earth outside by making burst into blossom, as in some springtime in old history among the airs of St. Louis, this dazzling and gilded carpet of forget-me-nots in glass. Formless water. You are a formless water that will trickle down any slope that it may come upon. A fish devoid of memory, incapable of thought, which all its life long in its aquarium will continue to dash itself 100 times a day against a wall of glass, always mistaking it for water. Fowls. The doctor's coachman was in the habit of placing in a hamper the fowls. They began to chase one another about the room, scrambling over the furniture, their wide sleeves fluttering like wings, clucking and crowing like a pair of amorous fowls. Fragrant petals. It had pleased him, on this occasion, to see the gloom of the little lobby shot with rays of pink and gold and white by the fragrant petals of these ephemeral stars, which kindle their cold fires in the murky atmosphere of winter afternoons. Freckles. My grandmother had drawn our attention to the gentle, delicate, almost timid expression which might often be caught flitting across the face, dusted all over with freckles, of this otherwise stolid child. Fresh air and country breezes. She did not reflect that the strong breath of genius must have upon the very soul of a child an influence at once more dangerous and less quickening than those of fresh air and country breezes upon his body. Fringed eyelids. His fringed eyelids darkened and drooped. Fruit. Every fruit visited and examined, one by myself. He had decided to send her a basket of fruit, and was not quite sure where or how to order it. He had entrusted the task to a cousin of his mother who, delighted to be doing a commission for him, had written to him laying stress on the fact that she had not chosen all the fruit at the same place, but the grapes from Crapotte, whose specialty they were, the strawberries from Jaeger, the pears from Chevet, who always had the best. Fuchsias. In vain might Madame Loiseau deck her windowsills with fuchsias, which developed the bad habit of letting their branches trail at all times and in all directions, head downward, and whose flowers had no more important business when they were big enough to taste the joys of life than to go and cool their purple, congested cheeks against the dark front of the church. To me, such conduct sanctified the fuchsias not at all. Fur. Gilbert was running at full speed towards me, sparkling and rosy beneath a cap trimmed with fur. Garden. And for all that he was driving through a city of stone to immure himself in a house without grass or garden. As I did not wish to leave off my book, I would go with it in the garden under the chestnut tree. Garlands. I wished to hold before my bodily eyes that I might know whether they were indeed as charming as they appeared to the eyes of memory, little hats, so low-crowned as to seem no more than garlands about the brows of women. Gentle lips. All the consonants which he did not manage to pronounce seemed like harsh utterance of which his gentle lips were incapable. Geological skeleton. The oldest bone in the geological skeleton that underlies our soil the true armor, the sea, the land's end, the accursed region which Anatole France, an enchanter whose works our young friend ought to read, has so well depicted beneath its eternal fogs, as though it were indeed the land of the Cimmerians in the Odyssey. Glancing eyes. I was one of those whose natural unworthiness would forever prevent them from penetrating into the mysteries of the life inside, which it was his duty to guard, and over which the ground floor windows appeared conscious of being protectingly closed, with far less resemblance between the nobly sweeping arches of their muslin curtains to any other windows in the world than to Gilbert's glancing eyes. Goat. Yes, you old goat. Gooseberries. Gooseberries, because in another fortnight there would be none left. Grace of nature. I did not thirst to know anything save what I believed to be more genuine than myself, what had for me the supreme merit of showing me a fragment of the mind of a great genius, or of the force of the grace of nature as she appeared when left entirely to herself without human interference. Grapes. Ask the doctor. He will tell you that those grapes act on me like a regular purge. She was obliged to put straight the bunch of black grapes which she had in her hair. Grass. I found an additional merit in everything that was in my mind at the moment, in the pink reflection of the tiled roof, the wild grass in the wall, the village of Roussainville, into which I had long desired to penetrate, the trees of its wood and the steeple of its church, created in them by this fresh emotion which made them appear more desirable only because I thought it was they that had provoked it. Gravitation. The interval of space separating her from him was one which he must as inevitably traverse as he must descend by an irresistible gravitation, the steep slope of life itself. Gravity, but that of Monsieur de Saint-Condé, girdled, like Saturn, with an enormous ring, was the center of gravity of a face which composed itself afresh every moment in relation to the glass. Great animal. What's the matter with you, sitting there gaping like a great animal? Great brow. Can I see any of his things in Paris, so as to have some idea of what is going on behind that great brow which works so hard, that head which I feel sure is always puzzling away about things? Great medley of trees. It is probable that, had I done so, those two steeples would have vanished forever in a great medley of trees and roofs and scents and sounds. Great spaces traversed. I can hear the echo of great spaces traversed.